Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. We're going to give folks about another minute or so before we get started. Well, hello again, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for another in our webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about systematic phonics instruction and why equity is such an important issue in this early literacy conversation. My name's Susan Lambert. I'm going to be with you for the webinar today. On the webinar with me is my colleague Julia. Julia is here for support, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can put some questions into the question box, and she's going to monitor those for me. She's also going to be my go-to in case anything goes wrong. She'll be interrupting and stopping me. So again, just excited to have you here with me. Some logistics before we get started. This is going to be about a 45-minute presentation, give or take a few. There is a chat question panel that if you have any questions, you can put that into the chat box, and Julia, like I said, is going to be monitoring those, and we'll talk about those at the end. So we'll leave those questions for the end. She'll be able to just sort of put those things together, and we'll answer some common themes. And just so you know, this session is going to be recorded in case for any reason you need to step away or you want to rejoin and listen again. You will be given an email link where you can listen to the recording again. As a reminder of who we are, many of you may have already been on other webinars in these series, but just as a reminder, Amplify has really been a pioneer in K-8 education since 2000. Primarily, we started in the space of assessment, but now we actually provide core and supplemental programs for ELA, science, and math. We really like to provide teachers with the tools they need to help them understand what's happening in the classroom, help them understand how to translate research into practice, and then be able to respond to the needs of their students. It's really exciting that at this point we're serving more than 3 million students in all 50 states in the United States. So again, my name is Susan Lambert. I'm the Vice President of Elementary ELA here at Amplify. I come from a background of the classroom as an elementary teacher. I worked as a principal. I worked as a curriculum director, a curriculum and an assessment director, and I've been in all of educational contexts. So I've taught in public schools, I've taught in private schools, and I've been in the charter world. I'm really thankful for you to be here with me today, really honored that I can be a follow-up session to both Robert Ponducio, who talked a little bit about the importance of a knowledge-based curriculum, the importance of background knowledge in terms of students' comprehension and their vocabulary development, and Carolyn Strom, who also talked a bit about foundational skills. If you missed those two webinars, I would really encourage you to go back and watch those. They both provide some just really great information regarding what it takes to close this gap with our students in terms of literacy. So today we really have three things that we're going to do on the agenda as it relates to foundational skills and equity in the classroom. We're really going to take a hard look at facing the problem. What is the problem in the context right now? And then we'll start to frame that issue and then work towards finding a solution. Like I said, if you didn't get a chance to listen to Robert and Caroline's webinars, I would really encourage you to go back. It will give you a wealth of background knowledge and also extend what we're doing here. If you were able to join them, I would also encourage you to go back and re-listen to them, because it may provide you a new lens in which to hear the information. So the hardest thing is always really facing the problem. There's so much fear in issues that seem complicated and messy, and early literacy is one of those things that can really be a struggle for us, or is a struggle for us as a nation, and in many, many contexts. And this simple graphic really just highlights the issue that has largely not changed over the last few decades, and that's this issue of reading proficiency in our classrooms. This is really what you're looking at here is the 4th grade reading proficiency. And the biggest bulk of this, the 64%, that's actually the number of students that are not proficient in reading. Again, if you were in Caroline's webinar, she actually highlighted the statistics to say that it's a real problem, and the problem isn't with 3rd grade teachers, or the problem's not with 4th grade teachers, right? The problem really starts when kids come to us in kindergarten and what we're not providing them in terms of early literacy to ensure that we're actually helping them be successful. This is just an example of what it might look like in a classroom. So let's just pretend that this is a classroom of students. You pick the classroom you want to envision. Maybe it's your own classroom. Maybe it's one of the classrooms in the schools that you oversee, or maybe it's several classrooms in the school that you oversee. And when we talk about that 64%, we're talking about that many students in our classrooms that are not successful in reading, not proficient readers by the time they leave us in 4th grade. And this really becomes a critical issue, because after 4th grade, as we know, it's very, very difficult to intervene in students' reading proficiency and work towards helping them be successful. And reading is a critical skill. We know that by the end of 3rd grade, if students aren't on track and proficient reading at grade level by the end of 3rd grade, that it has significant impact on their future success, both in the work environment and in college. And so I like to sort of visualize things this way when it comes to numbers of students in the classroom to really highlight the issue that we really have across the nation. When we look at that proficiency rate by race, the story isn't that much better. And this will show you just a snippet of those 4th graders that are actually below proficiency by race. So you sort of have to think in the opposite a little bit. These are not students that are proficient. These are the students in our classrooms that are not proficient. And you can see that it hasn't changed much from 2005 to 2017, that we're still looking in almost every category, a majority of our students in 4th grade that are not reading proficiently. So, you know, we know that the teacher is the #1 factor in classrooms. They are the people that are closest to the learning. They're the ones that facilitate and encourage that learning in the classroom. And they're the ones that are really not set up for success. So across the country, most teachers that are in elementary classrooms actually don't have extensive training in foundational skills. Many of them never take any coursework or even a portion of coursework that relates at all to helping students acquire the code. They don't know phonics, they don't understand phonological awareness, and then we put them in classrooms and ask them to help kindergartners and 1st graders get on track to become proficient readers. And so in some senses, it's not their fault when they were not trained to be able to do that and don't necessarily have the skills set, the background knowledge to be able to create that environment in the classroom. And I feel for this as an elementary school teacher who spent most of her career as a 3rd grade teacher. knowing that I didn't exactly have to worry about teaching kids how to read, because in my grade level, the shift was reading to learn, and I could focus on the comprehension element. But there was kids in my classroom that still needed intervention, that they didn't have the strong foundation. So in a sense, it was my responsibility, but I had no training in how to do that, and had to dig in and learn on my own what students were missing and how I could help them be successful. So really, this is a plea to say, we need to get this information in the hands of teachers and really support them so they can provide that kind of instruction and environment that our students need to be successful. And we're going to highlight that a little bit more as we start to talk about what this means in terms of an equity issue. So Louisa Moats, for those of you who don't know her work, is instrumental in the world of helping students learn how to read. We'll reference her work later on in this session, and I'll give you a resource that I would encourage you to purchase to better understand what students need in their reading development. But she reminds us that reading is the most studied aspect of human learning. As a matter of fact, there has been so much research done in the world of early literacy, teaching kids how to read, what kids need to have, that many reading scientists say now that like pretty much the case is closed. We know what works in terms of decoding, of teaching kids to unlock the code. So that's not the problem. The problem is, as a nation, we are not consistently doing this in our classrooms across the country. So I want you to stop, and I'm going to pause for about 30 seconds, 45 seconds or so, which can feel uncomfortable in a webinar for a long period of silence. But I'd really like you to think right now about, what do you know about the science of learning to read? Not about opinions, not about you know, even educational books that are written, but really the science or the research of what it takes to learn to read. So hopefully you were able to take a little bit of reflection there. Maybe you know a lot about the science of reading, and maybe that's what drew you into this webinar. Maybe you recognize that you don't know a lot about the science of learning to read, and that's what drew you into this webinar. Whichever place that you sit, I hope that the next several minutes and slides that we go through will either remind you of what you already know, extend your knowledge in some way, or really energize you to dig in more to find out what it is that we really need to bring to our students every day in the classroom. So let's take a little bit of time then to frame this issue. Now that we've seen this problem, that we have majority of our students across the United States not proficient, even not proficient yet at 4th grade. We have teachers that we just aren't preparing to actually deliver these early literacy skills in the classroom. And we actually know what the science looks like. We actually have some answers about what we can do. What is it then that we can learn from all of this? First of all, learning to read is not a natural process. And I think we forget this sometimes with waves of movement in early literacy that sort of come and go, like surround your students with books and they'll just sort of pick it up. Or a comment I often hear, many of my students come to kindergarten and they actually already know how to read. And what we need to know and what we need to remember is that speaking and listening is absolutely a natural process. And when kids come to us in kindergarten, they're naturally able to speak, they're naturally able to follow directions, and they've been doing that since birth, right? They've been hearing that language of that spoken language, and they've been able to develop communication styles in the context in which they're in, as well as being able to learn the language But learning to read in any language is not a natural process. And it's really quite complicated. And unless a child has a parent that's a reading specialist or a parent that's well-versed in phonics instruction, they likely are coming into kindergarten having memorized words or having been exposed to language and having a good intuitive sense of guessing at words. But the real complex process of decoding, they likely haven't been able to learn that comprehensively. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's called Scarborough's reading rope, and it actually comes from dyslexia research that it's been applied much more broadly to say that there are things that we understand about how students learn how to read, how they become proficient readers, and we need to pay careful attention to those things across the years, essentially. And so if you look at the top part of this, we see some threads in this string that are blue and purple. And we call these language comprehension issues. So things like background knowledge and vocabulary, that students actually read in sentences and groups of sentences where they're able to make connections between sentences and paragraphs and come away from a text with the gist of what the text is talking about. Much of Robert Ponduccio's webinar talked about this idea of background knowledge as a significant indicator of later reading comprehension and why it makes such a difference. So that's sort of the upper portion of this. The lower portion is all about word recognition. And this is the idea that we have sounds in the English language or in any language, and those sounds are represented by letters or series of letters. And those series of letters actually work together to form words. And this is also an essential element of teaching people how to be proficient readers. We often call this model that's organized this way the simple view of reading, right? So reading is actually not an easy thing to do, but the construct of learning how to read is fairly straightforward. You need to know how to decode, or the bottom part of this, the word recognition, and you need to understand language or have language comprehension. And so when you put word recognition together with language comprehension, you actually develop as a proficient readers. If you only can decode words and you have no language comprehension, you actually are not a proficient reader. And vice versa, if you have some kind of knowledge of the language, but you're not able to decode words, you can't also become a proficient reader. The things we're going to talk about today in terms of foundational skills sit down here, and Carolyn Strom also talked a lot about those things in her webinar. What we have to remember is the goal of all of these discrete threads is not to actually be discrete threads as proficient readers, but to be able to develop the automaticity that we need to have and the strategic thinking that we need to have to approach text in order to gain new knowledge or approach text for entertainment. And so again, the idea here is that we don't sound out words forever. We don't think about what sounds the letters represent forever. The goal is to develop into fluent readers so that these skills that we need to learn early on will actually go away. So just as a reminder of the context we're in, we're talking about foundational skills and we're talking about equity. And so first, before we sort of step into that equity world, let's just talk a little bit about foundational skills. What are those things that we're talking about? So in your standards, whether you use Common Core State standards, a derivative of those, but most every single standards framework has a section called foundational skills. And in kindergarten, first and second grade, for us, most of the time, foundational skills actually go through grade 5. We're going to really focus on K1 and 2. We're talking about things like print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition, and fluency. And we're going to see that they all interrelate with one another, and kids need to have a very coherent approach in terms of the instruction to really become proficient in these skills. You'll notice that print concepts and phonological awareness typically go away in standards after grade 1, so that we can then take those concepts, print, the ideas about how the sounds of the language work, and implement them and focus then on the printed word, meaning phonics and word recognition, with the ultimate goal of getting us to fluency. So why are these foundational skills important? Seems a little silly to talk about why, but let's go back to that NAEP data. Again, that hasn't changed for decades, right? Students are just not proficient in reading. And so focusing on foundational skills gives them that foundation, right? That strong foundation then to build upon and build upon and build upon. You may have also heard in Carolyn Strom's webinar that actually 15 to 20% of students demonstrate symptoms of dyslexia. That doesn't mean they're designated as dyslexic or they've been identified with dyslexia, but they're demonstrating symptoms of that. And what happens is when we bring them quality instruction, we then can alleviate the symptoms, which may further become a further problem down their reading career. And we'll come back to that in a few slides. And so then how does research tell us that we're supposed to approach this idea of foundational skills? I think too often we go right from the what directly into the discrete grade level standards, and we forget to think about foundational skills in the entire context and what kind of approach is most effective. And again, these things are largely known to be true and to be fact, right? Like you can go back to the National Reading Panel and follow some of those threads. I would encourage you to look on blogs like Shanahan on Literacy that talks a lot about what does this look like when we start to develop this into a classroom environment. But we're really going to talk about 4 things here. Number 1, a systematic explicit approach is most effective. And we're going to define that word systematic, and we're going to talk a little bit what that might look like over the course of grade levels. Number 2, that withholding instruction is detrimental to our most vulnerable learners. And by withholding instruction, I mean things like, well, we don't really think our kids can do that right now, and so we're not going to introduce this at that grade level. Or this particular student is 2 grade levels below, and so I want to make sure I come down to his or her level to meet them where they're at, as opposed to providing them the kind of instruction and then scaffolding that instruction. And so this is the place where the equity issue comes in, and we'll talk more about that. There's also this misconception that students will figure it out on their own. And research on foundational skills really indicates that there's actually only a small percentage of children that actually figure out this code all on their own. And the last thing we'll focus on is really this idea of quality, consistent instruction, and how when you have that in your classrooms, you can greatly reduce the need for intervention. And we'll talk a little bit about the RTI triangle and how in many of our classrooms across the country, that triangle has been inverted and flipped. So let's start first with a systematic approach. So let's actually start with the opposite of a systematic approach. So the opposite of systematic is random and incidental. And we don't ever want to do that in early literacy as we're developing and delivering our students the instruction they need in early literacy. So we need to be systematic. And what this means is we need to do it according to a plan or a system. It needs to be orderly, it needs to be methodical, and it needs to be regular, and it needs to be routine. And I think this puts people off sometimes because it sounds boring and it sounds laborious, but there's ways to actually make foundational skills instruction very interactive. Things like using a multi-sensory approach. Again, Carolyn referenced that in her webinar. But the idea here is that I know as a first grade teacher that the students coming to me all were exposed to and got instruction in certain sound spelling patterns or certain foundational skills elements. So I know as a first grade teacher, I need to continue that plan or that system along with the other first grade teachers in my school to ensure that by the time they get to second grade, they've had exposure to all the kindergarten and the first grade content. And I remember as a principal, an early principal in my first year, walking through the school and doing observations during the ELA block. And all of the K1 and 2 teachers taught ELA at the same time of the day. And so one of my very first observations was to walk in and just do a survey of what was happening in all of those classrooms. And I walked into kindergarten classrooms, and we had 4 kindergarten classrooms, 4 really great teachers, right? And I walked into one kindergarten classroom and one thing was happening. I walked into another kindergarten classroom and something else was being taught during ELA. And the third kindergarten classroom, something else was being taught. And in the 4th grade classroom, something else was being taught. Now, were they all great teachers? Yes. Were their students engaged in the learning? Actually, they really were. The problem is they were teaching different things. And so when we talk about systematic, we talk about teaching the same things to students, maybe not in the same way, but ensuring that all students are getting access to the instruction they need. Because what happens when those students are done with kindergarten, back in my days of being a principal, I had cards with each student's name on it. I knew this student shouldn't be matched with that student, and this student's parents request this teacher, and we like shuffled all those cards together, laid them all out, split the classes up, and then moved them on to first grade. And guess what happened in first grade? If we had students from each of those 4 different kindergarten classrooms that had 4 different ELA experiences, the first grade teacher then needed to make sense of where all those students were and what instruction they had. And then if you can imagine all the first grade kids being shuffled up and moving on to the second grade, all of a sudden we have divergence. And that divergence really becomes detrimental over time in terms of, remember, teaching kids foundational skills. So research tells us that a systematic approach is most effective, and we need to understand what that looks like and how to be creative within that structure. The reason that this is so important is because of our most vulnerable learners. And more, this issue is being highlighted to me and has just become a real passion and fire in my soul. This idea that you don't know when a student walks into your classroom if that student is going to be a vulnerable learner or not. Because often students can come to us and it seems like they've got it all together. They're going to be the ones that are going to be fine, and I can focus efforts other places. Or we assume that kids just can't do the work. Look at the end of grade level instruction. Oh, I don't think my kids can do that. And I've heard teachers talk like that, that the expectation they have for certain students is lower. And we have to quit that, right? We have to bring that grade level content and that access to all of our students, teach them at a high rigorous level, give them extra instruction when they're not achieving, and scaffold that instruction to help them be successful. But we can't assume that we know who those learners are. And so in terms of what students need, we need to teach them foundational skills because it unlocks the code for them to then be comprehenders. So most students aren't going to figure it all out. And you're probably wondering, what in the world is all of this stuff on the screen? Well, what we know is the English language is the most complex language to teach. But it's not without patterns. And this is sort of showing some of those patterns. There are 44 sound spelling patterns, or about 44 in the English language. And what we need to do is ensure that students have access to instruction in all of those 44 sound spelling patterns. So go back to those kindergarten kids that come into the classroom and they're already readers. Well, if we don't give them explicit instruction in all this code, we may find out that they hit what I call the glass ceiling. And that glass ceiling typically comes out in those fourth grade assessments. We used to call it the fourth grade slump. Now it's becoming more and more of an issue in third grade. And the issue is, yeah, they memorized words pretty well before they came to school. Maybe they had a parent that read to them over and over. Maybe that had a parent that helped them try to sound out words. But they need to understand the system of sounds, and that's what phonics instruction is all about, teaching them the systems of sounds. Are there kids that are going to pick up these sound spelling patterns much quicker than others? Absolutely. And that's when you need to approach students differently. But all students need to have access to this instruction to learn how to recognize the sound spelling patterns, to learn how to apply them in print, and also learn how to write them or go through that encoding process. And when students have that strong foundation, they're better able to make that transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And so then the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of these 4 bullet points, what we know works in teaching foundational skills, is this idea of quality instruction, reducing intervention. And so I'm sure all of you are familiar with RTI. Some places call it the multi-tier support system. Maybe some of you have more than 3 tiers, maybe you have 4, but the idea is still in place. The interesting thing about the RTI framework or the RTI process is that it was actually developed and communicated, starting in the healthcare industry to try to figure out or try to understand things that we can do to be preventative. The education context picked it up. And one thing that's been missing from RTI is really this idea of core classroom instruction or strong tier 1 instruction. When I go across the country and talk with district leadership, with principals, with teachers, their very first question for me is differentiation, right? So already people are focusing first on what do we do differently for students? What do we do in targeted small group instruction? And so often I ask context, districts, schools, teachers, do you have an intervention issue? And when I ask people to raise their hands, do you have an intervention issue in your school? Almost everybody raises their hands. And what we haven't done is we haven't flipped that to talk about what does quality core instruction look like. When I said that contexts now actually have an upside down triangle, what that means is that many places have more intervention, just like the 4th grade proficiency scores actually show us, and less students that are actually on grade level. And so what we need to do, and remember, we're talking in the context of foundational skills only. So print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition and fluency, is we need to ensure that we get all of our students in these classrooms that core instruction based on that systematic instruction framework to actually eliminate or reduce the need for intervention. And research will show us that when we do that, we can actually keep kids out of both needing intervention and keep kids out of being labeled or having to go on an IEP. So that's a lot of information, right? Probably a little bit overwhelming, probably pretty straightforward in ways that you may not have thought about it before. And so I want to turn to a little more positive note to say there is a solution to this. There is a way that we can bring that instruction that's needed for all of our students into the classroom to ensure that every student is successful. This is Louisa Moats. I mentioned her earlier in the webinar, and she actually says, you know what, teaching reading is rocket science, but we know how to make it work. let's not leave it to sort of teachers to figure it out that haven't had the instruction or the background in how to do this, but let's get them the materials they need to have, and let's get them the support that they need to have to ensure that students are successful in the classroom. If you'd like to dig into a little bit more work around what's happening, I would really recommend, this is the newest edition of Louisa Moats's book called Speech to Print. If I were in a school at this point, I would actually do it as a book study with my, for sure, K1, 2, 3 teachers to really understand how students come to us, knowing how to speak, knowing how to listen, and how do we take what they already know and help them transition then into learning to read and learning to write. And then just another really important book in terms of early literacy is this book called Beginning to Read. Both of these books, I pulled these images off Amazon. They're still available. And again, they're both just really strong text to help you get a better sense and better background about what this looks like in the classroom and why it's important. So the very first thing that I want to talk about is an ELA program in foundational skills has to have a scope and sequence. So this idea of systematic phonics or systematic instruction, meaning that I know in kindergarten, I'm covering these sound spelling patterns and I know the order that I'm doing them, so that by the time my kids get to first grade, the first grade teachers can reinforce and extend on what they learned in kindergarten. And so a scope and sequence is important for student learning. And it's also very helpful for teachers. Some teachers I know don't even understand what the designation here looks like, that this is not actually F, this is F as in fish and phone. And so just helping teachers be able to do that. Again, when we're talking about systematic instruction or working within a system of schools, we want to make sure that we're bringing students what they need at the grade levels they need it. The other thing that's really important about foundational skills and delivering that instruction is that we don't skip over this idea of phonological awareness. It's right there in our standards. It's important in kindergarten and first grade. For kids that still need practice with it, sometimes they need it into second grade and into third grade. And phonological awareness is that instruction that happens with the lights off. The instruction that we're just hearing sounds, and in this example, it's learning how to order environmental sounds, or we're just hearing the sounds of the language. So this is when students come to us in kindergarten and they've heard a lot of dialogue in their home. They've had parents that like maybe play rhyming word games with them or things like that. This is the development of phonological awareness. And that's important in any language, but that's important to then help students transition into what we call phonemic awareness, or this idea that sounds are actually represented by print. And there's sort of a one-to-one correspondence between some of this, and we want to help them make that shift. And then when we build those two things, we can work on what I call the basic code, or those sound spelling patterns that are most common in the English language, and then work them into what we call the advanced code, which is those sound spelling patterns that typically don't get explicitly taught in the classroom, but the ones that are important for students to recognize and understand, both for reading and also for spelling. We also want to make sure that our instruction in foundational skills does several things. The first thing is, research will tell us that explicit instruction is most effective. And that means introducing sound spelling patterns, have students play with those sound spelling patterns, and be very upfront and explicit about what they are. The opposite of explicit would mean, oh, we're just going to sort of randomly pick up a book and look at what this is. We're not going to give them real instruction. We're just going to hope that they absorb it. And that is not effective, especially for those students that are most vulnerable in our classrooms. And so we call this actually explicit instruction and decoding. But we also want to connect that instruction to what's called encoding, and that's learning how to represent those sounds on a piece of paper. So when we, for example, introduce the sound, we teach students that the sound is represented with the letter M, and this is how to draw it. And so we want to make sure that they're connecting then the decoding part of the sound spelling pattern with the encoding part. And this represents decoding, represents reading. The encoding represents writing. We also want to make sure that immediately following that explicit instruction in both decoding and encoding, students are applying their skills in real text. And by real text, I mean two things. Number one, that they're decodable for the students. And we know that controlled text can come in different ways. We can control them for vocabulary, like leveled text are, or we can control them in terms of the phonics. But we want them to have decodable text where they have access and exposure to those sound spelling patterns over and over and over again. And strong decodable text will allow students to practice and be repetitive in those sound spelling patterns in new contexts and in similar contexts and in new contexts. So they're actually connected. The idea here is that it shouldn't be one and done. When a kid actually gets the code and can maybe read a very short decodable sentence or groups of sentences with that, we shouldn't assume that they're done. We often use the example of batting practice, right? The best batters in the country actually take batting practice every single day. And if we want our students to develop as fluent readers, we need to give them exposure to these sound spelling patterns over and over and over again. And then when students aren't getting it, or they need more time in instruction or a different kind of instruction, it's at that point that we should intervene immediately and provide them with targeted support to extend that learning, to give them the extra practice that they need to have. This is just an example of what a strong decodable could look like. And students in strong decodables actually are very motivated in their reading, and they develop so much confidence. I've been in classrooms where students have gone from can't read anything to super excited about picking up a text, knowing that they can approach the text as confident readers. And this is also really important for those students that are most vulnerable. So I think this quote sums it up the very, very best, is that when you know better, it's time to actually then implement and do better and find ways that you can actually ensure some of these research-based strategies are actually implemented systematically within your classrooms or across your schools. And one way that you can do that is getting a quality foundational skills program. And here at Amplify, I'm very excited that Core Knowledge Language Arts, or CKLA, is one of those early literacy programs that's just really strong in bringing kids what they need to have in terms of early literacy skills. What we've been talking about are examples that come from our skills strand. Our skills strand includes the teacher guide that gives the teacher a scope and sequence and builds instruction around that scope and sequence. It provides students the kind of practice that they need, and teachers the formative assessment data they need to be able to know when to give them additional support when it's needed. And we provide those rich decodables organized like chapter books that help kids stay engaged in the reading process and really develop both fluency and confidence as they approach their reading. So that's about 45 minutes. I think I got that as close as anybody could get that. So I'm just going to stop here and just turn it to Julia and see if there's any questions that we've had pop up.
Hi, Susan. So we are getting a ton of really great questions. The first one is from Carrie. She's asking, we use a balanced literacy model. How can I convince our admin team that we need phonics instruction outside of readers and writers workshop?
Oh, that's a great question, and I love that question. I would say a couple of things. First of all, I really would encourage you to become an expert or a bit of an expert yourself in the importance of systematic and explicit phonics. One good website you can go to is Reading Rockets and look at the research will be there, but maybe also pick up one of these books that I shared. I think that we've seen a lot of places take our skills strand and be able to implement that alongside sort of a balanced literacy approach, with the idea being that kids need time in reading instruction using the decodables, but there's also a place for them to be able to have a volume of reading, to be able to independently pick up some of those leveled texts and look at them, but really, really getting strong foundational skills and decodable readers is really important. So I would encourage you to do a little work out there on the wide world of the web, but also pick up Louisa Moat's book, because it's really outstanding to help you understand the background to that.
Thanks, Susan. The next question is from Nicola. How should we go about assessing phonics?
Another really, really good question. I mean, my favorite phonics assessment, and it depends on what grade level you're talking about, but is to pick up the DIBELS assessment. You can actually Google it. It's free online that you can download it. And what's great about DIBELS is it gives you discrete areas of assessment that you can actually see where students are and what they're missing in terms of those foundational skills. If you're a CKLA user, of course, you can use one of our assessments that's embedded in our program, but DIBELS is a really good option as well.
Okay, another really great question here from Marshall. How does this relate to pre-kindergarten students?
That's also a really great question. I think if Carolyn Strom were here, and I have had conversations with her about that, she would say what's really important for pre-K kids is to make sure you're focusing not so much on introducing phonics right away, but the idea of print concepts and phonological awareness. So they need lots of practice with hearing words, with singing songs, with poetry that uses the words, nursery rhymes and fables. The more that you can get the rhythm of the language with students and help them with phonological awareness, they'll really be set up well in kindergarten to start then launching them into the phonics and word recognition. And of course, reading to them and talking to them about what they're hearing is also great.
Thanks, Susan. The next question just came in from Destiny. What would phonics look like in a third grade room with only a 60-minute block?
Oh, wow. Well, that depends on what happened in K1 and 2. So phonics in a 30-minute block, I think in third grade, and it depends on what state you're in, you would really have to approach this in terms of what do kids need, like what have they gotten? And I would really encourage you to use foundational skills like the DIBELS assessment that's available online to figure out which kids missed that code knowledge and which kids you have to intervene with. And I would say to chunk it out, depending on the needs of that classroom, to chunk it out into really quick 20, 25-minute foundational skills, and then find a way to actually incorporate science and social studies into your ELA instruction, which may give you a little boost in the time that you're doing ELA, just to help them get reading comprehension and some background knowledge.
Thanks, Susan. The next question is from Doris. She is wondering, why do so many school districts spend money on reading programs and use them for only a short period of time?
Wow, that's like $1 million question. I think it's really frustrating. I think it's a really good question that I ask myself all the time, actually. Because if we only use them for a really short time, we're not able to actually figure out how well they're working and what we need to do to supplement them. I think the best thing that we can do as a school or as districts is to, first of all, get in and do professional development individually, or grab a group of early, K1 and 2 teachers and really understand the research and what kids need. And that will actually, I think, help drive better decisions at the principal level or at a district leadership level, to sort of stop the madness. I mean, I think we're getting to a place in early literacy education that we're finally saying, listen, kids need to learn how to decode the printed word. And when you're not printing that, you're setting kids up for failure. And is that what we really want for our students in the future? And I think most everybody would say no. But anyway, getting back to your question, if you figure that out, let us know, because we actually ask that question, and I ask that question all the time. It's very frustrating.
Thanks, Susan. So we have time for just one more question. If there are any questions that we didn't get to, we will be sending them out in a follow-up email. So the last question is from Andrea. Is it best to use a scripted program, or what spelling patterns or approach do we start with?
It's a good question. And this again depends on if you're asking as a grade level teacher or more at a building level. And rather than saying scripted, I would say for foundational skills. And again, what I mean by that is print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition and fluency. Remember, we're not talking about some of the other comprehension, like not the reading informational text, not the reading literature, not the writing, but for those specific discrete skills, I think it's best to have a structured program because it will give you the scope and sequence. There isn't any research that says what the right scope and sequence is. The research says use a scope and sequence. So select a program for their scope and sequence. And this instruction shouldn't take your entire literacy block. Foundational skills instruction should be about 45 minutes of that block. And so the rest of the time should really be used for reading informational text and reading literary text, more speaking and listening, and more writing. But I actually think it is pretty important to have a very structured foundational skills program in your classrooms.
Okay, great. So those are all the questions we have time for right now, but we will be following up via email if we didn't get to your question today.
Great, thanks, Julia. And before we leave today, again, thank you so much for joining us. And like I said, I think I've said it like 4 times, I'm gonna say it 5. If you weren't able to see the webinar with Robert Ponducio and then the next webinar with Carolyn Strom, I really encourage you to go back and watch those. If you've seen them, go back and watch them again and see if you have fresh eyes or learn something new from them. And then if you're interested in learning more about Amplify CKLA program, which is a comprehensive ELA program for pre-K through grade 5, I encourage you to join Jeff Danamiller's webinar Tuesday, November 13th. He will just give you some great information about not just the program itself, but also about the why of the program. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. I hope you just have a blessed afternoon and enjoy the rest of your week.